All right, it's time to level up yet again, and we're now on level 6. And on this last level, we're going to talk about third-party OAuth. Now, what exactly is OAuth? You might have heard of this term, but all it is, it's simply an open standard for token-based authorization. Now, what did all of that mean? Well, let me explain. So you've heard of Facebook, right? But let's say that we're building a different web app. Let's say we're building a social network that's going to be the new Facebook, and it's going to be called Bracebook. And Bracebook is an awesome social network for people who have braces. Now, when you're a new user who's signing up for Bracebook, you probably won't have any friends in the beginning, right? And nobody likes a social network where you have no social connections, and nobody wants to feel like they have no friends. So what can we do as the developers of Bracebook to make this process of joining our social network a little bit easier? Well, we can ask the user for permission to access their Facebook account and see which friends they have on Facebook are already users of our service, Bracebook. So now, once the user sign up, they'll already see that 3 of their friends are already on Bracebook, and they're ready to get started in a new life of socializing with their be-braced friends. Now, how would this work exactly? Well, on our login page, we can ask the user to sign in either manually, where they don't get the benefits of instantly connecting with their friends who have braces, or we can get them to log in with Facebook. And in this case, what would happen is we would make a GET request to Facebook asking them for this user's friends on Facebook. And Facebook would return with a POST request with that list of users and emails. So this might be a really simplified version of that. It's just a straight up table of this particular user's friends on Facebook and all of their emails. So then this gets passed over to our server, where we can compare it against our database of users and see whether if we have any matching users who have the same email addresses. So now we know that for this user, we have 3 friends of theirs who are already on Bracebook, and we'll be able to automatically add them as a friend onto Bracebook. And it's also a similar scenario if you were signing up to LinkedIn, for example. If you couldn't be bothered to type in all of your contacts' email addresses to find on LinkedIn and add them individually, then what LinkedIn might do is it asks you to log in via Google, and it will look through all of your contacts on Gmail in order to add them automatically to LinkedIn. So by using OAuth, we're able to access pieces of information on these third-party websites, such as their friends' emails or their contacts on Gmail. But in our case, because we're talking about authentication and leveling up the security of our authentication, another really big benefit involves delegating the task of managing passwords securely to these companies like Facebook and Google. So as we mentioned before, every day or so, yet another company gets hacked. And these companies tend to be kind of low-tech companies that are not Facebook, Google, Amazon, who are really known for having great engineers, great teams, who are able to implement all of these levels of security for the authentication on their website. And they probably have thought about hashing and salting passwords or other data that they're storing. But there's more. There are things such as not only salting the passwords, but also peppering the passwords. Some companies also encrypt the entire database containing the hashed passwords and have a wide array of complex mathematical solutions to keep their user passwords under lock and key. Now, as a web developer, we could implement all of those things that I just spoke about and address all of the edge cases, but it would take us a lot of time and a lot of development hours. So why not simply delegate this task to a large company like Facebook and Google? So then every time we log in our user, we simply ask them to log in on Facebook, and Facebook will then authenticate them using their own secure methods. And once that's done, Facebook sends us back a message saying this user is authenticated, they're a real Facebook user, and they have got their correct username and passwords. So go ahead and authenticate them as well. And that will make our lives a lot easier. We'll have a lot less liability. And this is the way that you're seeing a lot of websites going, where they only have third-party login, like login with Twitter, Facebook, Google, GitHub. But in order for us to be able to do all of this, we need to learn about OAuth. That is the glue that binds all of this together and makes it actually tick. Now, what exactly is special about OAuth? Because there's a lot of other open standards that does something similar to this. But OAuth is quite special in 3 ways. The first way is that it allows you to grant a granular level of access. What does that mean? That means that when your user logs in with Facebook, you can request specific things from their Facebook account. So you could say that for my app, I only really need their profile and email address. But say if you were Tinder and you wanted to know who all their friends were so you don't accidentally match them up, then you might want to know also their list of friends. So this is what I mean by granularity. The app developer can determine what kind of data do they need from the user's Facebook account and request those accordingly. Now, the second thing about OAuth is it allows for either read-only or read and write access. So in the case of Facebook, this means that you can either ask them to just retrieve pieces of information about their Facebook account, so what's their name, what's their email, who are their friends, or you can ask for write access as well. Say, for example, in this case, if WordPress wanted to be able to post to Facebook on this user's account, then they would need to ask for read and write access. And the third thing is that the third party that you're using to authenticate your users should be able to revoke access at any point on their website. So that means if you're authenticating with Facebook, the user should be able to go into their Facebook account and deauthorize the access that they granted to your website, say Bracebook. And they don't actually have to go onto your website where maybe you're less keen to give up this access. So now that we've looked at what's special about OAuth, the next thing to talk about is, well, how does it actually work in reality? So the first step is to actually tell this third party, be it Facebook, Twitter, or Google, about our web application, because they don't know about us, right? So we have to set up our app in their developer console, and in return, we get what's called an app ID or a client ID. And we, or our website, is then the client, which will make the request to Facebook to authenticate our user. Now, once you've set up your app, the next step happens when the user tries to log on to your website. So when the user hits up bracebook.com and they want to authenticate, we give them an option to log in with Facebook. So once they click on that option, then we'll take them to the actual Facebook website so that they are seeing a familiar interface, a trustworthy interface, and they'll log into Facebook using their Facebook credentials. And without OAuth, what we would have to do is to ask the user, hey, what's your login credentials for Facebook? Can you give me your Facebook password? Nobody wants to do that. That seems super sketchy and really insecure. So OAuth makes that step a lot easier because it gets them to log in on the website that they actually trust, which is Facebook, right? Something that they've been using for a long time. Now, once the user logs in on this third party, then they have to review the permissions that our website is asking for. So, for example, you might want your profile and email address, and they review that and they're like, okay, I'll grant that permission. So now that they've granted the permission and they've successfully logged in on Facebook, then our website will receive an authorization code from Facebook. And this allows us to check to make sure that the user actually successfully signed on to Facebook. They had the right username and password. So we're now able to authenticate them and log them on to our website. But if we wanted to go a step further, we can also exchange our authentication code for an access token. And when we receive that access token from Facebook, we would save it into our database because this is the token that we can use if we want to request for pieces of information subsequently. This access token is valid for a lot longer than the authentication token. So the way you should see it is that the authentication code or the auth code is kind of like a ticket, right? A ticket that you're going to use once to enter the cinema. But the access token is kind of more like a year pass, and it comes with benefits like backstage access, where you get to request pieces of data from Facebook, including their friend list or their username or their password, whatever it may be that they granted you permission to access. So the auth code is what we need to authenticate the user that they successfully managed to log in through Facebook. And the access token is what we'll use to access pieces of information that are stored on that user's account on this third party's website. For example, their email or their friends list. So now that we've seen all of this, let's go ahead and actually put it into practice. And in our case, we're going to be implementing login with Google using Passport and Google OAuth. All right, so enough theory. Let's get started implementing it and adding login with Google to our website. So first things first, let's head over to passportjs.org and we're going to go and find the strategy that we need. So here you'll find there's two Google OAuth strategies. One is Passport Google OAuth, and the other one, if you scroll down a little bit, is Passport Google OAuth 2.0. Now, it's quite important that we choose the right one, and we're using the latest implementation of OAuth 2.0 with Google. So let's select this one. Now here we have the actual strategy npm package, passport-google-OAuth 20. So in order to use it, we first have to install it. So let's go ahead and copy this over to our hyperterminal, making sure you're still in the same directory, and we're going to npm install this package. Now, while that's going, let's take a look at what else we need to do in order to set it up and use it. So the first thing they want us to do is to create an application on the Google Developers Console. And there's a direct link that should take you there. Now, once you're here, you should be able to go ahead and create a project. So you can either click on here or go over here and click on New Project. Now, we're going to give our project the name of Secret, and you can leave everything else and go ahead and click Create. All right, so that takes a little while, but once it's done, we should be able to go ahead and set up our credentials for Google OAuth. So let's click on this tab, and the first thing we have to do is go to the OAuth consent screen over here, and we're simply going to configure the screen that the user sees when they log in through Google and grant your application access to their data. So it's helpful for them to know what application they're talking about. So we're just going to put in the name of our app here. And if you have a logo for your app, this is where you would upload it so that on that screen, when the user gets asked for permission for your app to access, say, their contact or their friends or whatever it may be, they can quickly identify who it is that's asking for it and just be rest assured that it's the right one that they're giving permission to. But in our case, we're going to leave all of that as blank. And the last thing that I want to point out on this page is the part where it says scopes for Google APIs. And here are the fields that you will receive once the user logs in through Google. So in our case, we're probably only interested in the email and the profile ID of our user who's logged in. Now, if you wanted more data from them, such as, I don't know, their YouTube viewing history, their list of contacts on Gmail, then you would have to add a scope. And in order to add scopes, you need to enable certain APIs. And Google API Library has a whole bunch of APIs that you can actually tap into. So you can see where they've been using the Maps API. You can see what emails have they got that are in drafts using the Gmail API. You could see what the YouTube videos they're looking at. And you can also find out who their contacts are through the Google People API. And all of those involve jumping through extra hoops. But in our case, we only want to authenticate them through the use of Google Login. So we don't have to do any of that. and all we need are the default ones that we get for free without even the user needing to see a permissions page, because these three things are transmitted every time you authenticate with Google. So now that we're done, the last thing I'll add is that once your website is up and running and you've got a custom domain name and it's being hosted, then you'll want to add all of those things in here, like a privacy policy page or a terms of service link, and also your main domain. So let's go ahead and hit save. And now we get to create our API credentials by clicking on this button. And the one that we want is the OAuth client ID. And this is going to allow us to authenticate them using Google. So we're going to be using the OAuth 2.0 protocol, and we are a web application. So we'll tick that radio button. And the name of our app is, of course, again, secrets. And there's two other fields that we have to fill in. One is the origin. So where is that request to Google going to come from? And in our case, it's going to come from our local host. So we'll put in http://localhost:3000. And this is obviously for when we're testing, and when your website's live, you can come back here and change it at any time. But while we're testing all of this, it's really important that we have all of these addresses and that yours matches what you see on screen exactly. So the second thing that we have to add here is the redirect URI. So this is a route that we're going to plan out on our server when Google has authenticated our user to return to, so that we can then locally authenticate them and save the session and cookies and all of that. So here we're going to put http://localhost:3000/auth/Google/secrets. And I'm going to come back to this route very, very shortly. But for now, just check to make sure that you have inserted in here exactly the same string as I have, because if it's not, then our authentication will fail and it'll be hard to identify down the line. So once you've made sure that both of these are correct, then go ahead and hit enter, and that adds those to our credentials, and we can go ahead and create a client ID. So now we get a OAuth client ID and a client secret. And these are super important, and you should also keep them secret. So that means we're going to put it into our .env file. So I'm going to copy my client ID. I'm going to go back to Atom and open up my .env file, and I'm going to add it in using the .env format. So this one is going to be client_ID, and it's going to be equal to that string that I copied over without any quotation marks or any other sort of JavaScripty type of things. And the second one is going to be my client secret. So let's copy that and add it in, client_secret. And this is going to be equal to that string. All right, so now that we can save those two things and we can get back to setting up our Google OAuth strategy using Passport. So we've done this part, we've created an application on Google Developer Console, and we now have a client ID and client secret. So now we get to configure our strategy. And the first thing that we have to do is we have to require this package in our code. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this part, and I'm going to change it to a const, but other than that, I'm going to leave it exactly the same. So it's a new constant called Google Strategy, and it uses the Passport Google OAuth package that we installed just now, and we're going to use it as a Passport strategy. And the next part is where we get to set up our Google strategy and configure it using all of those details that we received just now. So I'm going to select and copy all of this code from Passport use down to the very last semicolon just before authenticate request, and I'm going to paste it in here below where we have serialize and deserialize our user. So right here. And it's really important that your code goes in the right order. So for example, we can't put that code above this line because it won't work. And we can't put it above the session because then it won't save the user login sessions. So this is where we're going to put it after all of the setup and right before all of the routes. So let's go ahead and update some of these placeholders. So we have to add in our client ID, which is in our .env file. And so we're going to write process.env.client_ID. And we're going to do the same for our client secret. And finally, we have to change the callback URL to the same one that we put in on the Google API dashboard. So if you want to remind yourself what it is that you set, just click on that and you'll be able to see it right here. And in fact, I'm just going to copy that string directly so I don't make any typos. And I'm going to paste it in between the quotation marks. And my callback URL hits up a path on my server at /auth/Google/secrets, which we will set up very, very shortly. Now, there's just one more thing that we need to add to this configuration. And the only reason why we need it is because Google has recently announced that they are sunsetting the Google Plus API and all things related to Google Plus. And they're finally giving up on trying to make people use their Google Plus service as a social media site. So if we head over to the GitHub repository for this package, you can either paste this into Google or right-click here and click copy. Now, if you click on this actual address, it takes you to a resource, but we actually want to view it on GitHub. And you can see that the link is here in the text. So we're just going to copy that, and then I'm going to paste it in here, and that's the actual repository on GitHub. So here, if you go into the issue section, I've noticed that people have been talking about the Google Plus deprecation. And the problem is that Google made a recent announcement saying that Google Plus is sunsetting. So previously, this package relied on Google Plus to obtain user information. So they got the user's Google Plus profile. And people are wondering, how do we proceed once that API deprecates? So if you scroll down a little bit, you'll notice there's a post by this guy, Marshall of Sound. Usually the most helpful posts have the most upvotes or thumbs up, and you can see that when you're just scrolling through as well. And this guy has very kindly done all of the heavy lifting for us, and he's put in a new pull request to fix this package in regard to this deprecation of the Google Plus API. So now what he's saying is all you have to do to fix this is to simply add this in the strategy options. So let's go ahead and copy all of this, and we're going to paste it right at the end here as the final option. So after the callback URL, we're going to add a comma to separate it, and we're going to paste in the user profile URL option set as this link. And I'm just going to delete the single quotation marks and change it into double just for consistency's sake. And now when we use Passport to authenticate our users using Google OAuth, we're no longer going to be retrieving their profile information from their Google Plus account, but instead we're going to retrieve it from their user info, which is simply another endpoint on Google. Now, how would you have known to do this? Well, it's very likely that at some point, if the Google Plus API deprecates, then your code might not work. You're probably going to get some warnings down the line in your console, and it'll tell you something like Google Plus API deprecated, fix it by doing this. And I'm simply pointing you to this to future-proof the course, because I know that in a few weeks or a few months, Google is going to pull the plug and your code might break. But adding this means that we should be now future-proof, and it should now work for you, even if you're listening to this far ahead in the future. So the next thing I want to point out is here are all the options for using the Google strategy to log in our user. And once that's gone through, we have a callback function. And this is where Google sends back a access token, which, if you remember, is the thing that allows us to get data related to that user, which allows us to access the user's data for a longer period of time. We've got their profile, which is essentially what we're interested in, because that's going to contain their email, their Google ID, and anything else that we have access to. And finally, we use the data that we get back, namely their Google ID, to either find a user with that ID in our database of users or create them if they don't exist. Now, the thing you have to realize is that if you try to search for this method, find or create, it's not actually a MongoDB or a Mongoose function. And if you click on the first thing you see in Google is a Stack Overflow query. And this guy says, I can't find the documentation on this function and I can't make it work. And the answer is, this is not actually a function. It's something that Passport, the people who documented this package, came up with as pseudocode, so fake code, and they're basically trying to tell you to implement some sort of functionality to find or create the user. And they point out how you might be able to implement something like this. So find one and then create the user and then save the user. So you can either follow this advice or something that might make your life a little bit easier is this guy has pointed out that there's actually an npm package called mongoose-find or create. And this package essentially allows you to make that code just work. So they've created that function for you in the package, and it does exactly the same as what this person has described up here. And all you have to do to make this work is to just install it and require it. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's npm install mongoose-find or create. I'm just going to copy it from the docs and paste it in here. And once that's installed, the next thing we have to do is to require it in our app.js. So I'm going to create a new constant right at the top, and I'm going to set it to equal find or create. Notice how this is spelled exactly the same as this. And when we tap into this find or create, it's going to look inside this package to see how it should implement that function. Now, the final step that the documentation tells us to do is to add this as a plugin to our schema. So similar to what we did with our Passport local Mongoose package, we're going to also add this find or create package as a plugin. So user schema.plugin find or create. So now our code should work and we should be able to tap into our user model and call this function find or create, which previously didn't exist. So now that we've set all of this up in our backend, the next thing to do is to figure out a way for us to be able to tap into it from our front end, right? At the moment on our website, there's no way of logging in with Google. If I run my server and I go over to localhost 3000, then you can see when I click on login or register, there's no button for me to go down the Google authentication route because all of this is linked up to our local authentication. So what do we have to do? Well, we have to add some buttons onto these websites. So if you head into our views and go over to register.ejs, if you scroll down, you can see there's a section of HTML code that is commented out. So if you select all of it and uncomment it, by using command / or control / on Windows, then we now have activated our code here. So now when I refresh this page, we get a button over here that's sign up with Google. And let's go ahead and do the same on our login page so that they can access the sign in with Google both when they try to log in and register. So these buttons are pretty much identical, other than where they're located. One is in register and one's in login. And they both contain a anchor tag that links to the href /auth /Google. So when the user clicks on this button, it's going to make a GET request to this path. And we haven't actually addressed that in our code. So let's do that now. Inside our app.js, right below where we've got our app.get /root route, let's go ahead and add a app.get for the route that the button will hit up, which is /auth /Google. And then let's add our callback. And inside our callback is where we're going to initiate authentication with Google. So to do that, we're going to use Passport, of course, and we're going to authenticate our user. And then we provide the type of strategy that we want to authenticate our user with. So this is going to be Google as a string, but in this case, we're using the Google strategy. And notice how this is very similar to the code that we've got down here when we authenticated our user using the local strategy. So we're starting to see how Passport can be used flexibly, and by adding in or switching out different strategies, we can implement lots of different ways of authenticating our user using the same library. Now, the next thing we have to provide is a scope. Now, how do I know about all of this? Well, of course, it's from the documentation. So if you scroll down a little bit on the Passport Google OAuth documentation page, you can see that they've got all of this in here for you. So for simplicity's sake, you can simply go ahead and copy this and paste it in here as well. So in this case, what we're doing is we're saying, use Passport to authenticate our user using the Google strategy, which we have set up over here as a new Google strategy, passing in all of those things to help Google recognize our app, which we have set up in the dashboard. And then we're saying, when we hit up Google, we're going to tell them that what we want is the user's profile. And this includes their email as well as their user ID on Google, which we'll be able to use and identify them in the future. So I'm just going to go and change those single quotes to double quotes. Again, for consistency, it doesn't actually change anything about our code. And this line of code here should be enough for us to bring up a pop-up that allows the user to sign into their Google account. So let's go ahead and save our app.js and make sure that our server is still running. And let's go ahead and test it out on localhost. So let's head back to the home page, go over to register and click on sign up with Google. And now you can see we get redirected to a page on Google itself, and we're able to log in using our Google account. So I'm going to select my account to log in, but then I get an error and it says cannot get /auth/Google/secrets. Now, if that route is familiar to you, there's a good reason for that, because that's what we set up right here, our authorized redirect URI or URL. And this is where Google will send the user after it's authenticated them on their server. You can see it's pointed us back to our website, localhost, right? So we need to add this route to be able to authenticate them locally on our website and to save their login session using sessions and cookies. And if you take a look at the next part of this authenticate request documentation, you can see they provided an example of how you might set this up. So it's again going to be an app.get, and this request, this get request, gets made by Google when they try to redirect the user back to our website. And this string has to match what we specified to Google previously. And then we're going to authenticate the user locally, and if there were any problems, we're going to send them back to the login page again. But if there were no problems, then we can redirect them to the secrets page or any other sort of privileged page. So let's go ahead and copy all of this and paste it into our app.js right below the other app.get. And I've just noticed that this is also single quotes. People are very inconsistent when they type JavaScript, but I like to keep it all the same just so it doesn't confuse me. And we're also going to change it here. Now, notice here that the route is /auth/Google/callback. We have to make sure that this gets changed to the route that Google actually tries to hit up, which is the one that we specified here, which is going to be /auth/Google/secrets, or whatever you typed into your dashboard. And all we have to do is change this to secrets so that it matches exactly. Now, the rest of the code we can leave as the same, because if the authentication fails, then we're going to redirect them to the login route. We have a app.get for the login route, but if it was successful, then we're going to redirect them to the secrets page. So we're going to res.redirect. It's going to go to /secrets. And this will take them to here. and we can check to see if the user is authenticated, in which case we'll render the secrets page. Otherwise, we'll redirect them back to the login page. So this is pretty much all the code that we need in order to allow users to log in using Google on our website. So let's check out what we get back from Google by going into this callback function, and let's simply log the profile of the user that we get back. So now when the user clicks on that button that says sign up with Google, it will hit up the auth/Google route, which gets caught over here, and that will initiate authentication on Google servers, asking them for the user's profile once they've logged in. Now, once that's been successful, Google will redirect a user back to our website and make a GET request to auth/Google/secrets. And it's at this point where we will authenticate them locally and save their login session. Now, once they've been successfully authenticated, we take them to /secrets. But at this stage, the Google authentication has already completed, and this callback function gets triggered. And we will log their profile and try to create them as a user on our database. So let's save our app.js and test it out. So let's go back to our homepage, localhost 3000. Let's register over here, click on sign up with Google. And I'm going to sign in using my Google account here. Now, at this point, you might end up with an error like this: failed to serialize user into session. Why is this? Well, at which point do we serialize our user? It's right over here, right? And this code actually comes from a package that we used earlier on, the Passport Local Mongoose package. And they provided a simplified way of serializing and deserializing your users using their package. So it's through the use of this package that's been added to the user schema where this method serialize user and deserialize user comes from. Now, however, if we look at the Passport documentation and how they configure the Passport package to serialize users and deserialize users, you can see it's a little bit longer, but it means that it's going to work for all different strategies, not just for the local strategy. So let's go ahead and replace the code where we serialize and deserialize our user for local authentication and replace it so that it can work with any kind of authentication. So let's hit save over here. And now if we go back to localhost 3000, we register our user using Google, then you can see it takes us straight to the secret page. Now, the other thing we try to find out is we try to log the Google profile that we got sent after the user's been authenticated by Google. And you can see that it's this JSON over here, and it has a ID for the user. So this is going to uniquely identify this user on the Google user database. It has their name, and it can split it into family name and given name. It's also got some photos if they have any, a picture of them. But the most important thing for us to save into our database is this ID, because this ID will identify them when they next try to log in. So if they create any data on our website, we're going to associate it all with this ID. So if you look inside our database at the moment, you'll notice that a new user was created, but all we have is an automatically generated MongoDB ID and nothing else. Whereas our previous users had a username and a salt, a hash, or an email and a password. But in this case, we don't really have anything for this user. And we don't have any way of tying this newly registered user with their Google ID. So the next time they log in, we won't be able to find them on our database. And I can confirm this by simply logging out and trying to log in again, sign in with Google. And you can see that in our database, all we've done is just create a new user. We now have the 7th user. So their Google ID is not being tied to their ID on our users database. So let's go ahead and delete these two entries. And let's go and fix our code. So at the moment, when we get the data back from Google, not only do we log their profile, but we also try to find it in our database or create them on our database. And that's all based off a field called Google ID, which is supposed to exist on our collection of users. But at the moment, our collection of users only have two fields that we work with, email and password. And this is based off the days when we were still logging users only through the local authentication methods. So let's go ahead and add a new field called Google ID with a capital I. It's also going to be a string, but this time when a new user registers on our website, we're going to find and see if we already have a record of their Google ID on our user database, in which case we're going to save all the new data associated with that ID. Or otherwise, we're going to create it on our database and save this information for future. So let's save our app.js and log out of our website and then go ahead and register again. And we're going to sign up with Google. And now if we go over to our Robo3T, you can see our new user gets created with an ID that identifies them on our user database, but another ID that identifies them as a unique Google user. So this is their ID, which means that if I log out now and I try to log in again, I get to the secrets page, but we don't actually create a new user. They're still being identified as user 6. And this is the same thing even if I log out and try to register again as the same Google user. You can see that I'm still not creating another user here because I'm able to find this user by their Google ID and know that they already exist. Now, remember that because we're authenticating our users using Google, we only get what's equivalent to their username on the Google user database. We don't get their password. And this is great because it means we don't have to save it. We don't have to take care of it. If it gets lost or it gets leaked, that's all on Google. And they have a lot more engineers, a lot more resources to keep their users' passwords or whatever other pieces of information safe. And all we need to do is just to retrieve it when we need it. So the last thing I want to do before we finish up is to style up our buttons. Because if we add a few more buttons over here, sign up with Google, sign up with Facebook, it doesn't really shout to me that this is something related to Google, right? So what we're going to use is something called social buttons for Bootstrap. And all we have to do is go ahead and download the code. And inside the extracted folder, you should see a file called bootstrap-social.css. And we're simply going to drag that file into our public CSS folder next to our styles.css. So I'm just going to grab that and pop it over here. So if you take a look at it, you can see that it's basically a minified version of some styles that we can apply to any of our buttons to add in some much needed styling. So first things first, if we're going to add in a new style sheet, we have to head over to our header.ejs and add it in as a link. And whenever I add in any sort of styles from any external source, say Font Awesome or Bootstrap, or in this case, the social buttons, I like to put it above my custom style sheet. So that means I can go into my style.css and override anything that came from other people. So this is where I'll be adding in a link for that style sheet. And if you right click on that style sheet that we just got, we can click on rename, which allows us to see its full name. And I'm going to copy it and paste it over here. And we're going to make sure that there's no / before the CSS. And this href should now point to that new file that we downloaded and incorporated. So now let's hit save and go over to our register page and update that anchor tag so that we add in the required classes. So the classes that we need are btn-social, which adds some of the sizing and the rounded corners, etc. And then whichever social button we want. So in our case, it's going to be btn-social and btn-Google. So now if we hit save and go over to our register button and refresh, you can see it now starts looking a lot more like a proper sign up with Google button. And in the future, if you wanted to add another button, say, I don't know, sign up with Facebook, then all you have to do is to change this to Facebook and change the icon to Facebook. And when we refresh, you can see we now have multiple social sign-in opportunities for the user, and it's all styled with very little effort from us. So I'm going to go and delete that last part, and I'm going to go into my login and also implement the same thing for this button here. So btn-social and btn-google. So now both my login and register pages have their buttons styled up and also working. Plus, best of all, because we've implemented sessions and cookies, even if I go ahead and navigate to a different page, I should still be authenticated and be able to access the secrets page without logging in again. But notice that when I click on log out and I try to log in again, I don't get taken to Google again and have to log into my account. And the reason is because we're only persisting the login session on our website. So it means that once they manage to get to secrets and they navigate around on our website, if they wanted to access the authentication required route, so secrets, remember that in our code, when they hit up the secrets route, we run the request.isAuthenticated to see whether if we can render that page for them. So this login session and logout session is related to how they can access our website, but it doesn't log them out of their Google account. In order to do that, we would need a button that would redirect them to accounts.google.logout. But that's kind of annoying because it means that it would log them out of their Gmail, their Google Maps, and every single other service that they use on Google, which is usually not what you want. So in our case, we only need our session to persist for the user's login for our website, and we don't need to worry about logging them out of Google. So now that we've implemented the Google OAuth social login strategy, and we've kind of delegated this whole complicated process of securing a user's sensitive information to Google, as a challenge, I want you to try and see if you can implement login with Facebook. It will involve pretty much the same steps as what we've done with Google, but it will involve a little bit of searching around and a little bit of Googling and a little bit of figuring it out. But at this stage, you should be able to struggle through this and figure out how you can implement it without too much help from myself. So best of luck, and I'll see you on the next lesson.